Welcome to One with the Other Way, a podcast about your journey and finances. I'm your host, James. We have Wanda and Peggy with us today. Today's episode is going to be focusing on lingo that you commonly hear in the financial industry, maybe on the news, maybe talking, in different groups of friends or different circles or in business. Some of these terms are said often, but honestly, I feel like not defined well for just the lay people. So, Wanda, what do we want to kind of talk about today first?
Well, I want to talk about this speaking another language because I recently had my car repaired. And when you go to the mechanic, that's a whole nother language. And this is the thing with finances. It's a whole nother language. Because we work with it every day, we tend to throw around words. And so we want to define some of those words that are commonly used. Not that you remember, but AI is a good place to ask questions. And I think the first question is you hear a lot of talk about the market and the economy. What's the market going to do? What's the economy going to do? And so, James, I think you have a master's in this. And
Masters in economics, you mean? Yeah.
yes. So why don't you go ahead and define the difference between market and economy for us?
Well, when people talk about the market, they're referring to the stock market, which is it's just a relationship between companies and their stock and how they are
Right.
doing in
Mm-hmm.
their stock. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can just look and see as businesses sell their services, their revenue goes up, and then their numbers should reflect, in theory, into their stock price. But in a short, it's just how companies are doing individually, and we view that in their stocks, as opposed to the economy, which is kind of a very broad, overarching thing. It's just a relationship between production and consumption in a country, region, nation, however you want to define it. And we measure that through GDP. So speaking of GDP, why don't we go a little more into that, Peggy? I figured you might want to define GDP and maybe how it differs from, I don't know, say CPI, which is another commonly referred to term in terms of the economy.
And before you get there, every country has a
Yes,
GDP.
every country does have a GDP. This is
Yeah.
correct.
GDP is gross domestic product. And so that actually measures the output of a country for their goods and services. So that's how it measures what the country is actually producing. So that's what GDP is. And then CPI is consumer price index. And that measures what consumers are paying for their goods. So it's not the same as GDP. And, you hear those numbers a lot thrown around when we're talking about the economy and we're talking about markets and all of that. So GDP, gross domestic products, that's what the country produces. And CPI is what the consumers are paying for goods and services. And those are two things that we measure. And it's something also that is involved with when the Fed's having a meeting. We all hear about the Fed meetings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe Wanda would like to explain a little bit about those Fed meetings.
Before we go into Fed meetings, I do want to add something. A commonly referred to term with CPI is the basket of goods, is how
Oh, that's
we
true.
talk about it all the time. If you would imagine yourself going to the grocery store, what was in your basket, that is what they would define as with CPI. You would track the prices of the different purchased goods over time
Right.
to see how inflation is affecting them. And we'll get into that later after we talk about Fed meetings. But you look at CPI, it's more prices of different items. GDP is output based off of finished goods.
Well, specific things, because that's another thing, right? That's what we're
Yes.
saying about basket. It's not
Yes.
everything that you
Yeah,
purchase.
exactly.
Because could you imagine if they had to track every single thing, right?
Sure.
So they track a specific group of things. So it's the same for GDP and CPI. There are specific things that are tracked.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that at a later time.
We're gonna have a podcast specifically
Yes.
about
A lot of these
CPI as a
topics we
podcast.
will go into further depth in the coming weeks. So
Right.
that being said, I will say there's a common discussion in economic circles about, is GDP a accurate reflector of an economy? And there are a lot of things that are left out in GDP, and we'll get into that in a future episode.
Yeah, so right. A lot of these words are very gray, and so not black and white, but there are what they call those school book definitions and then the reality. And so the Fed is really considered defined as an independent organization that governs monetary policy. It was set up a long time ago by Hamilton, and it is designed to control the cost of money, basically. But then you can go into the black and white of it. It's a board of governors, right? There's 7 members of the board of governors. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York president is the president of the Fed. And then there's 11 regional banks in our country. And this is all around monetary policy and the cost of money. Those are the 11. Only 4 of them are represented at any time in the board as a voting member. All 18 people go to the meetings and are part of the discussion, but only 4 get to vote on the Fed, whether or not the Fed will raise the rate or lower the rate, which is kind of interesting. And then the Board of Governors is designed to basically do 4 things, right? They're designed to do monetary policy, promote our financial system, foster payment and settlement back and forth, and promote consumer protection and community development, all great topics. But the big thing you hear about the Fed is the overnight lending rate, or the cost of money for a bank to borrow money overnight from another bank to ensure that they have the reserves that they need in their bank. And that rate, how much it costs one bank to borrow from another bank, went to 0 during COVID, so that banks, that reduced the risk in allowing banks to go back and forth and borrow money as needed during that crisis time. At the same time, though, the normalized rate of the Fed is closer to around 6%. Currently, right now, it's 4.5%. If the rate is higher, right, then that's supposed to temper or control inflation. A higher rate means money is more expensive. It's supposed to be working to help keep down inflation. The United States right now is looking at raising the rate one more time this year. The alternative is true. A lower rate means it's less expensive for banks to lend or borrow from each other. There's no right or wrong answer in this.
How does this Fed funds rate relate to the interest rate?
Right. So if, right, banks are making money lending to people, basically, then, and if they're lending to people and they're trying to make sure that they have enough reserves to meet the requirement, then it costs them less to lend to people, and they can charge them less. For us, consumers, the big thing is always the mortgage rates. Mortgage rates are determined in large part by the overnight lending rate. If it costs less for the bank to borrow from another bank, your mortgage rate's going to go down. To that point, right, the Fed determines the rates, but more important than the Fed determining the rates is the words that the Fed uses. And so normally they have 8 meetings a year to which they discuss, should we raise the rate? Should we lower the rate? What are the reserve requirements? Do we need to, 3 things, right? What are market requirements, right? What's the discount rate and how much that the banks need to keep in the reserve? Those are the things that they discuss. And then they have a press release. And in that press release, people determine what's going to happen next. They take their crystal ball. They start determining what's going to happen next. Are they going to raise the rate? And then people will start taking action based on the tea leaves that they read in the Fed notes. And those notes include things like counting the number of times they use the word concerned or inflation or any of the number of things. So they may or may not lower the rate. That's the black and white. The emotional gray part, the words that are used help determine, again, forward thinking what we look at for monetary policy.
Right. So that's another thing that we hear a lot about it, right? In the words they use, and words do matter. And, all these different things that we're talking about, right? GDP, CPI, interest rates, all of that stuff. So Wanda, you mentioned really briefly inflation. So that's another thing I think that is not very well understood as far as how much goes into the study of it and how you determine what you can do to change that. And that's a big part of the Fed's job. But maybe, James, you want to just define what is the actual definition of inflation?
Well, inflation is just when the purchasing power of the dollar drops. So in relative to prices of goods and services. So, for example, if you were going to the store one day and buy an apple for $1, if the price was inflated,
Special apple.
you would have it'd be one really, really nice apple, I know, right? If an apple was $1 one day and then the dollar dropped in value, then maybe it's $2 the next day to buy the apple. So did the apple grow or get better in that day? No, it's just the dollar is weaker as opposed to the apple. So that's a rough definition of inflation, and that is what the Fed is trying to help curb. I do want to mention though quickly that yes, you said raising the rate or lowering the rate, what kind of effects it might have. And so if you lower the rate, it does make borrowing cheaper, but at risk of inflation. So if you lower the value, more dollars going to be in circulation, and therefore you could have inflation. So they have to monitor these things, and they make changes trying to keep inflation at, I think, 2% is what they try to keep it at. So, and we can get further when we talk about inflation and monetary policy, why they like that 2% number. But for this episode, that's roughly what they try to do. So you had mentioned, a press release, these reports. Another common report that comes out and we see in the news is the jobs report, talking about unemployment. Now, Peggy, if you would go into kind of what this jobs report is, what do we mean when we talk about unemployment rate? Let's just kind of hit on that real quick.
Okay, well, so the quick, easy answer, right? We're going to talk about this more in depth at another time, but it's what it says, right? The unemployment rate. So how many people are unemployed? And there are different parts to the unemployment, and there's different people who come into the employment market, people who leave, say they retire, or they just say, I'm not going to look for a job anymore. And that all gets, discussed in another podcast. We'll go into that a little bit more in depth. But basically, the unemployment rate is the rate of people. So it's obviously a percentage of people that are in the job market, but are not employed. So that's the unemployment rate. And then the jobs report is within a specific period of time, how many jobs were added to our economy? So how many jobs came into the economy that were created? So a company says, oh, we have this big contract coming up. We need another 100 people. So that's 100 jobs created, right? So that, again, is a number that helps with the economists and their studying and the Fed and do we have a lot of jobs being created? Are jobs not being created? So is the job market going up or going down based on what's happening with companies? Are they creating jobs? Are they having layoffs, which then those jobs go away? So that's basically what the jobs report is and what the unemployment rate is.
And aren't there a bunch of different numbers listed, and they all have different meanings on each of the different lines of the jobs report?
They will. It's really a complicated thing. And I don't think, for the most part, unless you're really like James, an economist or, really into those things, I think it's not something that a lot of us really pay that much attention to. It's like the mechanic. And I don't want to know technically how the valves are working in my engine. Like, I got the overview and that's good enough. And I feel like a lot of that's true in our world too. We throw out all these acronyms and all these reports and everybody's all excited about it. So I think that we can talk about those specific numbers in another podcast so that we talk about what goes into the jobs report exactly, and who makes the jobs report and where does that come from and what are they tracking? Because again, they're not tracking every single job. Like sure. I did not report that we had a job that we were creating when we hired you, James.
Sure.
Right? Because we're a small company.
I'm going to laugh because unemployment is really only important if I'm unemployed and I want a job. That's when we really pay attention to it.
That's
right?
when the individual pays attention. That is true. That is true.
But for the most part, it's unimportant.
And then I will also say a bunch of numbers, and you'll learn this, and we'll probably talk about this in a future episode, is that cherry picking is a real thing. And so you can make numbers say whatever you want if you really try hard enough. That doesn't mean it's correct. So always context is important. And so while this is more of a summary episode, we will go further in depth on some of these things. And in future episodes, we'll have in the show notes some studies if we discuss something to kind of outline kind of why we're saying what we're saying. So it makes a little more sense.
Right.
So Mark Twain says, right, there's lies, and damn statistics.
That's
so
it's
to
lies,
That's what he says, yeah.
lies.
So our final topic I want to hit on this because this is actually more of a current thing that's being brought up is tariffs. And Wanda, I want to get, this is to those that don't know what a tariff is, what is a tariff and why is this being so talked about heavily?
Okay. Black and white definition for a tariff is a tax imposed by one country on goods and services imported from another country to influence the country, to raise revenue, or to protect competitive advantage. And it's gotten a lot of headlines because the current president uses the word a lot. He imposed tariffs in his previous administration. Those tariffs were, for the most part, kept in place by President Biden in the previous administration. Much of them have not changed. And again, in the news, because it appears to be a controversial topic. And you see this in the car industry. We impose a 10% tariff to cars coming into our country, and actually a negative 1% on the tax side, which I thought was pretty interesting. I looked that up because that's something that affects. And then when tariffs are broadly applied, that's the one thing. But then when there are agreements between countries, right, then the tariffs are usually negotiated between the countries. And this in specific is Canada, Mexico, and us. And those are our number 1 and 2 trading partners that will get carve outs, right? Which is why you see a lot of the cars being built in Mexico and coming up here, or from Canada coming up in here. I think it's more emotional on the gray than in the reality. It can cause goods to become more expensive to the consumer, but we find historically that companies end up taking or swallowing those losses internally. Might affect their revenue, in the years to come, but only time will tell. And nothing has really changed in the industry, even though we're seeing a lot of this tariff talk in the headlines. So
I will add, so yes, there you could, in theory, shift costs to consumers. There's also technically another case you could make for foreign monopolies that is discussed in international economic circles because the price is so inelastic, because people are likely to buy that good regardless because there's really only one seller of that good. I guess an example could be like OPEC.
Oh, OPEC is very topical, but actually more topical today is the chip space. Today, very specifically, China came in with a lower cost chip to NVIDIA, very specifically. And so they are probably doing something to subsidize that industry.
Yes.
Which is going to affect us. So, again, these are all moving targets. And then it could be that we then subject them to a tariff on those chips, which are very much needed. And that would be potentially protective of our industry, as well as attempting to influence China and reduce their competitive advantage. We're going to have 4 follow-up topics, and we're going to do, what are the 4 going to be, James?
The 4 are going to be the stock market versus the economy. We'll kind of go a little bit more into the GDP and the CPI part of that, kind of how we look at an economy. We'll look at the Fed meetings and the interest rate a little further. We will also discuss the jobs reports and unemployment rates in an episode. And then inflation will kind of we'll cover in one episode as well.
So those 4 topics. Okay.
Yes. So thank you for listening to today's episode at Finances for Our Life here. We would love for you to meet with us. You can find us at financesforourlife.com. Schedule an appointment with Wanda or Peggy. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. We post every 2 weeks, and we look forward to hearing you in the next episode. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advice offered through Finances for Real Life, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision.